The world didn't notice him at first, just a thin, dust-covered boy wandering along a quiet beach in Ajit. But if you looked closely, you'd see something unsettling. He walked as if he didn't entirely belong to this world. His name was Jiddu Krishnamurti, and before he shattered every spiritual system humanity had created, he was a child no one believed would ever do anything meaningful. Because here's a rare truth almost no one talks about. Krishnamurti was considered mentally slow as a child. His school teachers called him dull, unfocused, vacant. He daydreamed so much that even the teachers pitied him. And yet, that same child would one day stand before thousands, dismantling centuries of tradition with a single sentence. Truth is a pathless land, but that transformation, from a fragile, silent boy to one of the most radical thinkers of the modern world, began the day destiny knocked on his door. And destiny looked like a British man with a strange stare. The discovery on the beach in 1909. A theosophist named Charles Leadbeater was walking along the shimmering sands of Adyar. When he froze mid, he saw a boy bathing in the river skinny, ribs showing, head down. Leadbeater later wrote something astonishing. That boy has the most extraordinary aura I have ever seen, utterly without selfishness. This is one of the rarest documented claims in the history of modern spirituality. And with that single sentence, Krishnamurti's life stopped being his own. The adoption nobody remembers. Most biographies mention Annie Besant adopting Krishnamurti, but they don't mention the painful part. Besant fought Krishnamurti's biological father in court, and won. Rare fact, his father cried so violently during the verdict that onlookers had to hold him up. Rare fact, Krishnamurti himself stood silently, trembling, not understanding why strangers were deciding his fate. Besant believed he was destined to lead a global spiritual movement. Krishnamurti just felt confused, uprooted, and alone. The training of a world teacher. From that moment, everything changed. He was taken to Europe. Tutors were hired. Schedules were created. A curriculum designed for a messiah was imposed on him. But here's another rare truth. Krishnamurti hated studying. He wasn't able to memorize anything. He stared out the window during lessons, lost in internal visions. His closest companions later said he seemed more like a visitor than a student. Rare fact. Despite this, he eventually learned flawless English and developed one of the most hypnotic speaking styles in history. Rare fact. He was trained in posture and silence, how to stand, how to walk, how to hold an audience with stillness. And the quiet boy transformed. Slowly, painfully. Into a symbol, a destiny he never wanted by his late teens. The Theosophical Society declared him the future world teacher. They built an entire global organization for him. The Order of the Star in the East. Thousands joined. Millions contributed. Books were written about his future. Ceremonies were held to prepare the world. But there was a secret Krishnamurti never revealed publicly. He didn't believe any of it. Rare fact, he once confided to a close friend that he felt like an actor trapped in a role he didn't choose. Rare fact, a French theosophist kept a private journal about Krishnamurti, showing signs of deep internal conflict. Those pages were locked away for decades, and then life made a choice for him. The death of Nitya, the shattering his younger brother Nitya, was everything to him. His emotional center, his confidant, his companion. They lived together, traveled together, slept in the same rooms, shared the same fears. The Theosophists even told Krishnamurti that the masters had promised Nitya would live long enough to support the world teacher. Esse mission. But in 1925, Nitya died suddenly. Rare fact, Krishnamurti screamed for hours when he heard the news. Rare fact, he refused food for days, collapsing repeatedly. Rare fact, he privately called the Theosophical promises a betrayal of the soul. His world split apart, and through that crack, something else entered. The awakening under the pepper tree, Ojai, California, 1992. Dosa, small cottage, a lonely pepper tree. behind it. Krishnamurti sat beneath its crooked branches one evening, exhausted from grief and inner resistance. What happened next is one of the most mysterious events in modern spiritual history. A violent pain shot through his spine. He screamed, collapsed, woke, collapsed again. Witnesses said his body burned as if electricity surged through him. Hours passed, then silence. When Krishnamurti finally opened his eyes, he whispered, "I have drunk at the fountain of joy and eternal beauty." But here's the rarest detail. He never called this enlightenment. He refused every label. He simply named it the process, a word that would appear in his secret diaries again and again. The greatest breakaway in history then came 1929. Thousands gathered in Amen for what they believed would be a sacred coronation the moment Krishnamurti became the world teacher. Instead, he stepped onto the stage, looked at the sea of worshippers, and said, "Truth is a pathless land. No organization can lead you to it." Then he dissolved the order. Rare fact, he returned all the money, property, and gifts millions worth. Rare fact, some leaders fainted from shock. Rare fact, he refused to let anyone touch his feet ever again. This wasn't rebellion, it was liberation. For the first time, he wasn't a symbol. He wasn't a chosen one. He wasn't a savior. He was simply himself, and with nothing but silence and a burning question. Can the mind be utterly free? Krishnamurti stepped into the world as his own teacher, a man without doctrine, without religion, without authority, a philosopher walking through the ruins of everything ever built for him. And the real revolution had only just begun. He had walked away from the crown the world tried to place on his head, and for a moment, the world didn't know what to do with him. A messiah who refused to lead, a guru who told people not to follow, a teacher who insisted he wasn't a teacher. Krishnamurti became a paradox, and paradoxes are dangerous, because they expose truths we spend our whole lives hiding from. But his new journey didn't begin on a stage. It began in silence. In small rooms, in long walks with a notebook he rarely wrote in the disciplined freedom of a man determined never to belong to anything again. This was the era when the world met the real Krishna, and he was nothing like the one they expected. A man who refused to be special. After dissolving the order, journalists begged him for explanations. "Are you still the world teacher?" one asked. He smiled gently and said, "If I say I am, will you follow me? And if I say I am not, will you stop seeking?" The man couldn't answer. Rare fact, Krishnamurti almost never gave yes or no answers. He believed direct answers made the listener dependent. Rare fact, he refused to let anyone address him as master, guru, or even sir. He preferred simply Krishna. But though he rejected authority, his influence only grew. From Europe to India to Australia, halls overflowed. People stood in windows, climbed trees, sat on roofs just to hear him. And the strangest part, he hadn't prepared a single sentence, the silence before words. Before every talk, Krishnamurti would sit backstage utterly still, his hands open, his breathing calm. Observers expected him to meditate. Rare fact, he didn't believe in meditation as a method. He said methods created dependency and imitation. But here's the deeper, rare truth. Krishnamurti entered a state of absolute inner quiet before speaking, sometimes for hours. He once said the words came through him only when the mind is completely empty. And when he walked onto the stage, he always began the same way. A long pause, a gaze that seemed to look through people, and then a slow, deliberate question. Can we together explore this? Not teach, not preach. Explore. The unexpected friendships Krishnamurti avoided gurus, priests, religious leaders of every kind, but he formed rare, surprising friendships. With Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World, once said, "The most penetrating mind I have ever encountered." They walked for hours in Ojai, discussing intelligence, freedom, and the danger of conditioned thought. Rare fact, Huxley secretly recorded some of their conversations. Those tapes were discovered decades later. With David Bohm, the quantum physicist, this was one of the most extraordinary intellectual relationships of the 20th century. Bohm said, "Krishnamurti is the only person who makes me feel my brain is still asleep." Rare fact, Krishnamurti helped Bohm through a severe psychological crisis, something Bohm admitted only near the end of his life. With pupil Giakar, India's cultural minister, she became one of his closest confidants. Rare fact, her private diaries reveal moments where Krishnamurti broke down, exhausted from the process that still tormented him. The process, the pain nitrogen monoxide one saw even in his 40s and 50s. Krishnamurti continued experiencing the mysterious physical agony that began under the pepper tree. His head would vibrate. His spine would burn. He'd collapse without warning. Rare fact, doctors found no medical explanation for these episodes. Rare fact, Krishnamurti sometimes woke screaming at night from intense energy surges. Rare fact, he called the force moving through him immense, beyond the personal. But he never turned it into a miracle story. Never took advantage of it. Never allowed followers to mythologize it. Instead, he buried it in his diaries, records so raw they were kept unpublished until after his death. A man without a home, Krishnamurti lived out of suitcases for most of his life. He moved through Ojai, London, Madrid, Switzerland, Brockwood Park, New York, Sydney. But he never settled. He ate lightly, walked daily, slept little. Rare fact, he never bought a house. He said ownership created psychological burden. Rare fact, he disliked luxury, yet accepted simple comfort when needed. Not out of attachment, but survival. Rare fact, he once slept on floors during travel, refusing special treatment, even when wealthy donors insisted. The private Krishnamurti the world never saw publicly. He looked serene, calm, almost saint-like. But privately, they had quirks, humor, fragility, pieces of humanity few people talk about. Rare fact, Krishnamurti loved cars fast, elegant ones. He drove them with surprising joy. Rare fact, he laughed frequently, sometimes uncontrollably, especially with children. Rare fact, he disliked loud music, and once walked out of a room saying, "Noise brutalizes the mind." Rare fact, he was terrified of snakes. This fear never left him. Rare fact, he cried Esla not from sadness, but from overwhelming perception of beauty. This wasn't a saint. This was a painfully alive human being. The teacher who destroyed teaching Krishnamurti's talks in this middle period of his life grew sharper, deeper, more confrontational. He attacked nationalism, organized religion, psychological authority, self-help systems, ideologies, meditation techniques, spiritual ambition, he once said. The moment you follow someone, you stop following truth. This sentence alone created a silent revolution across Europe and India. Rare fact, his talks were banned twice in certain political circles because they were considered subversive. Rare fact, monks from multiple traditions tried converting him. He simply smiled and said, "I see no difference between your prison and the next." People came expecting wisdom. He handed them a mirror instead. The schools, the future he tried to protect in the midst of this philosophical storm. Krishnamurti did something surprising. He helped build schools, not to create followers, but to create free humans. Brockwood Park in the UK, Rishi Valley in India, Oak Grove in California. Rare fact, he personally walked the grounds of each school, adjusting classrooms, questioning teachers, even choosing tree locations. Rare fact, he insisted children must never feel spiritually guided, only encouraged to observe the workings of their own minds. These schools remain his living legacy, not as temples, but as laboratories of freedom. A new kind of revolutionary by his 60s, Krishnamurti wasn't a mystic, a philosopher, or a prophet. He was something much harder to define. A man who had burned every bridge behind him so he could walk forward without a shadow. His message grew bolder. You are the world. The violence inside you becomes the violence outside. He challenged nationalism, patriotism, religious identity, not politically, but psychologically. He said humanity was drowning in fear, desire, conflict, comparison, and he insisted liberation wasn't a future event, but a flame that could ignite in the very moment one became aware. This chapter of his life, his middle years, wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about war, a war against the conditioning of the mind, a war that only one person could fight. And Krishnamurti stood on stage after stage, country after country, whispering one truth that shook people awake. You must be a light to yourself. No one else was coming. Soft wind, distant chimes, a quiet room, and a voice. What if the greatest revolution is not fought in streets, but inside the human mind? Krishnamurti believed exactly this, and spent the last years of his life trying to ignite that revolution in anyone who truly listened. But these final decades were also filled with secrets, dramatic revelations, and astonishing moments most people have never heard of. One, the man who could silence a room without speaking in the late 1970s. Krishnamurti often spoke in auditoriums so silent that, as one eyewitness described, you could hear your own heartbeat arguing with you. And yet, before some talks, he would sit absolutely still, not meditating, not pre-parting, just observing. Rare fact: observers noted that Krishnamurti could sit unmoving for over 45 minutes before a talk. His breath, barely noticeable, something doctors later found unusually slow and controlled. Some believed it was the result of decades of inner discipline. Krishnamurti denied it completely. I am simply aware, nothing more. Awareness creates its own order. But his stillness wasn't what shocked people. It was what he said in 1980, something he had avoided for almost 60 years. To the secret he kept hidden for 6 decades. For most of his life, Krishnamurti refused to talk about the mysterious experiences that followed him since childhood, the process, as he called it. Rare fact: in his private notebooks from 1961 to 1965, he secretly documented intense episodes of physical pain, radhyansa, and states of awareness he described as the otherness, the benediction, and an energy not of this world. These notebooks were never meant to be published. But after his death, they were released, revealing a man torn between two worlds, the ordinary and something profoundly unknown. In one entry he wrote, "There was a sense of vastness, as if the universe had opened its eyes through me." He never allowed followers to turn these experiences into religion or mysticism. To him, they were simply the consequences of a mind fully awake. 3. The day scientists tried to solve Krishnamurti. In the early 1980s, a group of neuroscientists visited Krishnamurti in California. They believed that his extraordinary clarity might correspond to unusual brain activity. Rare fact: during one session, scientists attached electrodes to measure his brain waves. The readings showed a sudden, unexplained shift into extremely coherent patterns. Unlike typical waking states, the moment he fell silent, the scientists were stunned. Krishnamurti simply laughed. "Do not study me. Study yourselves. I am not important. What is important is freedom." But something else happened during that meeting. Something he rarely revealed publicly. For the one question that made him angry, a scientist bluntly asked, "Are you enlightened?" The room froze. Krishnamurti, usually calm, controlled, became visibly irritated. Rare fact: witnesses said it was one of the only moments in decades where he displayed open frustration. He stood up and replied, "Sir, enlightenment is not a badge. It is not a state to achieve. It is the ending of the observer. And if you are asking that question, you have not even begun." It was a moment that stunned everyone present, because beneath the irritation was a message. Seeking a spiritual title is only another form of ego. 5. His unfinished mission. Krishnamurti's last decade was filled with urgency. Rare fact: abisited. Over 12 countries between age 80 and 90, sometimes giving 40 talks a year, despite doctors' warning of severe heart strain. He refused to slow down. He believed the world was heading toward dangerous psychological fragmentation, and that only a transformation of consciousness could prevent it. One of his closest associates later revealed, rare fact. He often said privately, "Humanity is running out of time. If we do not change, conflict will become our shadow forever." These words were spoken in the mid-1980s, but they sound painfully relevant today. 6. The final interview and his last warning in 1985. During one of his last televised interviews, he said, "If you truly listen, realidlisten, you will see the whole of existence in a single movement. This is the real revolution. To see without the past interfering." But what followed shocked even his closest companions. Rare fact, he said off camera, that humanity might never again see someone with the same insights, because the window through which this perception comes is closing. It was the closest he ever came to acknowledging the uniqueness of his role, a role he spent a lifetime denying. 7. The night before he died, in February 1986, one night before his passing, Krishnamurti spoke quietly to a small circle of friends. Rare fact, he said. I do not think people understood. Only a few. The teachings are out there. Whether anyone lives them is another matter. He then added something chilling, something he never said publicly. I am leaving, but the door is open. If you are serious, you can step through it. These were some of his final recorded words. Not poetic, not dramatic, but deeply human. 8. The last mystery. The missing recordings after his death. Dozens of recordings were discovered in various archives. Rare fact, some tapes contained private conversations where he discussed the danger of turning him into a spiritual icon, something he feared more than death. Several recordings remain unreleased due to legal restrictions, believed to contain Krishnamurti's most candid remarks on consciousness and suffering. What's in them? No one fully knows. Maybe they'll be released someday. Maybe never. 9. Who walked away from being a messiah, and this brings us full circle to the greatest rare fact of all. Krishnamurti is perhaps the only figure in modern history who was proclaimed a messiah, given a worldwide religious organization, and chose to destroy it voluntarily. He didn't want followers. He didn't want worship. He didn't want authority. He wanted one thing, a mind free from fear, a world free from division, and a human being who sees without distortion. The final line, as he once said, the moment you rely on me, you are lost. The moment you see yourself clearly, the whole universe opens. The revolution he spoke of is not in the world outside, it's in you.